quality of a Fire Emblem map can be separated into 5 different factors. Flavor, how well the map matches the story and atmosphere that it is trying to portray, and whether or not it succeeds at making you feel like you're really experiencing the story as the developers intended. Objective, what the map is asking you to do in order to finish the chapter, be it seizing, routing, escaping, or defending. Is it offering you an objective that is interesting to work towards? Replayability, you finished the chapter, now how do you feel about it? Frustrated? Relieved? Satisfied? There's any number of possible outcomes that can occur after finishing a chapter, so consider whether or not you'd enjoy playing the chapter again on a subsequent playthrough. Difficulty. Difficulty might not be an important factor for everyone, but a fair amount of players yearn to be challenged by Fire Emblem, to be given a puzzle to solve with the resources provided. Was the map that you just finished difficult in a compelling way? Enjoyability. Plain and simple, is the map fun to play? Are you having a good time whilst playing it, and if so, are you able to articulate exactly why the map is so stimulating? When all of these variables are managed effectively, what you're left with is an incredibly satisfying chapter to play through, providing a memorable experience for the player that they'll hopefully be excited to enjoy again during a second playthrough. And if you don't pay attention to this formula, what you're given is some of the worst the series has to offer. My name's Blute. Welcome to F.O.R.D.E. Trick to you, it's not scripted content. I'm going to be flying off the rail because making a script for an entire thing is hard when I want to do these every week. Welcome to F.O.R.D.E. We're going to be talking about chapters every single week. Maybe, but I'm going to be making these pretty consistently because I actually do want to make a consistent stream of content. And short as well! Nice and concise! We will not be saying the same thing over and over again. But anyway, welcome to episode 1, Unbroken Heart. I wanted to start with a nice and simple one rather than go into something that's a little bit more complicated. And Unbroken Heart is generally a chapter that is pretty easy to just kind of point and laugh at in terms of map quality, because it's down there. Plus, I figured that starting with a chapter that introduces the namesake of the damn show is probably a good idea. Don't ask how many acronyms I had to go through before I got to F.O.R.D.E. It was not a good time. But yeah, we'll be talking about mostly... There's going to be like 4 types of episodes with this. Like, there's going to be good maps, there's going to be bad maps, and there's going to be underrated maps and underhated maps. This one's very simple. This is just a plain old bad map. I think everyone can generally agree that this is one of the weakest chapters in Sacred Stones. Now, Sacred Stones has a pretty reasonable early game overall. I'd say early game goes from prologue all the way up to chapter 8. As soon as the route split happens, I think you've transitioned into mid-game. And out of all of the chapters in early game, I'd say Unbroken Heart is probably the worst one, without very much competition. I actually think Sacred Stones has a pretty solid early game overall, whereas Unbroken Heart just feels like it has a lot of flaws compared to a lot of other chapters in early game. Like, off the top of my head, another, like, weak chapter in early game. Like, chapter 1 is fine, chapter 2 is fine, chapter 3 is a little bit boring but fine. Chapter 4 is a little bit boring but fine, chapter 5 is completely good. I'd actually say chapter 5 is a pretty good chapter. And then, like, 6, 7, 8 are all, like, decent. I'd say 5 Guardian's pretty much the only early game chapter that I actively don't like. Like, I'm fine with having a simple early game. It's early, you gotta introduce the game's mechanics to the players, you gotta ease them into it. You can't just start with, like, 10 different side objectives and really, really tough bosses or anything like that. You gotta introduce the player, you gotta ease them in. But yeah, let's get into why Unbroken Heart is just not a very good chapter. For starters, this is, excluding the criteria, I guess, Unbroken Heart is classified as a Gaiden chapter, which always really bothered me. In the sense that it is a side story, I guess the Gaiden chapter is technically correct, because it is a side story. It's Erica wondering, I wonder what Ephraim's doing at this point. But there are no side objective requirements required in Chapter 5 to get it. You will always get it. So in the sense of a gameplay perspective, the Gaiden tag on this chapter, on 5 Gaiden, is completely pointless and kind of actively lies to the player, because it makes them think that there's going to be other Gaiden chapters, and then you make it through the entire game and not a single one occurs. So, I don't know, it's kind of a minor gripe, but it always just kind of bothered me. You could call it Chapter 6 and it wouldn't really change anything. But let's begin with Flavor. The entire crux of 5 Gaiden, it is, as I mentioned, just a quick look into what Ephraim is doing while Erica is basically just going through the motions of your standard Fire Emblem early game of going through bandits and brigands. And it kind of, in a weird way, like, in a weird ludonarrative dissonance, I'm sure I used that incorrectly, it kind of displays that Ephraim fully understands how Fire Emblem works, because the entire crux of Ephraim's, like, point of view at this point is that Ephraim's army is exactly as it appears. It's not like you have a bunch of like hidden like militia in your army, like a lot of Fire Emblems do. Like how in Three Houses you have battalions to signify that your army is actually bigger than it appears. No, Ephraim's army is literally just 4 units, canonically. They state multiple times his squad is fucking tiny, which leads me to believe it is literally just him, Ford, Kyle, and Orson. Now, this may seem really silly just right away, but by doing this, it kind of promotes the idea that Ephraim's company is just a bit above Erica's in terms of strength, which honestly is actually portrayed relatively well, as while the units you get aren't like insanely strong, they definitely do feel like they are just one step above Erica's in terms of strength, obviously excluding Seth. But there are also a lot of units that do just feel quite weak in Erica's army, like Naimi and Ross and Colm. They just feel a bit weaker than your average unit. Meanwhile, Ford and Kyle really feel like what Franz can become with a good amount of training, and Orson can just straight up act as a reflection of Seth. I believe he's slightly slower, but he hits a bit harder. So in terms of that, the chapter is like presented as Ephraim ambushing an army with an incredibly like elite squad of troops, meaning that they should just crumble relatively easily under like a really like quick strike. Which they do, because it's Sacred Stones, and I don't really think we need to discuss the overall difficulty of Sacred Stones. They'll fold like paper. While it might seem kind of boring, I think it actually does succeed on the flavor front, which I'm kind of, like, I'm a little bit surprised at myself. It's like, oh, it actually kind of does succeed in the flavor. Because while the flavor is incredibly easy to achieve, it does succeed at that. It is just a rush through the castle, like just sweeping through, cleaning out all of the units along the way. It feels like you're constantly just moving forward to maintain the surprise advantage you have, which completely works with the flavor of the chapter. Again, yeah, it feels weird to compliment a chapter I otherwise, like, really dislike, but, I guess, yeah. Big old tick for flavor. It works. It might be very unambitious and not particularly exciting to play through, but it does succeed at flavor, and I can't deny that. Congratulations, Unbroken Heart. You got one! Unfortunately, something a lot less positive will be the O in objective. Sacred Stones doesn't exactly have a wide variety of objectives. I feel like it mostly just falls under the standard trinity of seize, rout, and defeat boss, which is inoffensive on its own. When you use them a bit too often, it can be pretty uninteresting, and this chapter definitely falls into the same issue, as it is just a seize chapter, and seize chapters, in general, they're a bit contentious, because at the end of the day, they are just defeat boss with an extra step. Like, there is nothing special about seize. It's effectively just defeat boss, which in itself is also basically just rout. If anything, I feel like rout actually would have been a more fitting objective, because it would have fit with the flavor and would have actually encouraged you to kill every unit, which is effectively the objective anyway. So it being seize doesn't really add anything, so to say. You could potentially make this into like a different type of map. I don't know, you probably have to change the story. Like, you could definitely make this like a defend chapter. If anything, you could change the story slightly to make that chapter 8 a defend chapter from Ephraim's perspective, but that's a whole different ballgame. The fact that the chapter is seized doesn't really add anything, and it isn't like an interesting objective. There are interesting seize chapters for the most part. Like, when I think of interesting seize chapters, I think of late game chapters in Fire Emblem, where they are seized and you have tons of resources and are presented with tons of obstacles. Like, it feels like you are genuinely like wading through tons and tons of formidable troops and like status staves and siege tomes and ballistas and dangerous like Draco Knights and all that to get to your throne. It's like a really nice reward at the end. Like, yes, I've seized the castle, I've done it, I've seized the day. Whereas here it's just, you feel like 4 adults going to a spelling bee and bullying a bunch of children. It doesn't really work. So that's a big old failure for objective. And this frustration is going to get further exemplified when we shift on over to the chapter's replayability. A lot of people will have that moment when they're replaying their favorite Fire Emblems, when they sigh deeply because they made it to that section. When I say that section, it's that part that just feels like it drags on for fucking ever without any sign of ending. And it's like, if it's bad enough, it can actually cause your entire playthrough to just go, nope, I'm done, we're just gonna stop right here. Like, some chapters are actually that bad, and they pop up at like such an inconvenient place, so they're like, fuck, I gotta play through like Henri's Way in New Mystery. I gotta fucking play through McClann's wacky Tower of Terror in Three Houses. And for me, at least, I'd say Sacred Stones has that a little bit with Unbroken Heart. There's definitely more, like, offensive chapters. There's maps that throw gimmicks and just unfun bullshit your way that clearly haven't been tested very well. But for me, 5 Guiding commits the greatest sin that a chapter can ever, like, heinously execute. And it's something so horrific that it needs to be noted at every possible opportunity. So listen close. The chapter is fucking boring. The objective is effectively just to move your units from point A to point B and just cut down any enemies that may block your path along the way. Which sounds fine for an early game chapter on paper, but the map is just so long and big for no reason. And I talk about this a lot with Fire Emblem, and it's like, you need to utilize space very, efficiently. Like, you should have no area of your map where you're doing nothing, so to say. Like, there are a good amount of maps in Fire Emblem where there's just a good chunk of the map in, like, a corner or an alcove somewhere. It's like, there's no point to this area. It exists purely to make the map, like, a nice square. Which isn't that bad on paper, but when you consistently do it on multiple maps, or do it multiple times on a single map, it becomes really noticeable, and it's kind of obnoxious. But this map actually falls under a different issue, in that the map makes you use pretty much all of it, which really sucks. Because it is like Chapter 8 in FE6, where you are led down a castle corridor that has a bunch of winds and turns, which both, one, don't make any sense from, like, a building perspective. Why would you build a castle like this? I know it's, like, a really, like, nitpicky gripe. I don't care. It's dumb. And two, it just makes turns almost, like, doubles the amount of turns you need to take. And there's no creative freedom, so to say, which might seem like a bit of a strange complaint for an early game chapter, but every single time you play 5 Gaiden, you will be playing it the exact same way. There is no room for creative freedom. There is no room for deviation or versatility. Every single time, you will move up to the chest room, you'll get the chests, and then you'll just move along the scripted path like it's a cutscene, cutting down every single bozo along the way. You'll get to Zonta, you'll kill Zonta, and then you'll seize. And make sure to get Orson's weapons, because he's not allowed to have nice things. It makes for a very, very bland chapter that has no replayability whatsoever, because it's going to be the exact same thing every time. A lot of Fire Emblem maps can feel like an interactive story, and that they feel different every single time you play them. This is not one of them. This is a very much a straight line chapter, and it is not exciting. And this is driven home even further by the D in 5 Gaiden. Or the lack thereof, so to say. Obviously, Sacred Stones isn't hard, it's not a secret at this point, it's almost certainly the easiest Fire Emblem overall, but it's especially apparent in a chapter like Unbroken Hearts, where it's kind of asking you to believe that the enemy forces are putting up a reasonable fight for the protagonists, when in reality, they're just kind of falling down as soon as blue meets red. Your units are very strong for this point of the game, and enemies are still comically weak. It's one of the biggest issues with Sacred Stones is just, yeah, there is very little difficulty because enemies feel like children who just picked up weapons. So it makes the chapter just feel like a way to grind your units, which is also especially redundant because all the units you've been given are new anyway. So if you're just being given a bunch of new units to feed them gallons and gallons of XP, it just feels a little bit silly, especially considering you can grind units outside of chapters anyway. This also wasn't helped by the fact that the chapter is also on casual mode, as 2 of your units will just straight up come back in Chapter 8 should they die, and Orson is gone after this chapter. So the only unit that actually matters in terms of like mortality is Ephraim. And again, Ephraim is very strong for this part of the game. Like, he's very bulky, he hits very hard, he's reasonably like speedy. Even on hard mode, I want to say he doubles at least half of the enemies on the map. And you're absolutely showered with vulneraries and elixirs. Like, there is just nothing going on with this map in terms of difficulty. This is a map where I just turn my brain off and just try to get through it as quickly as possible. Overall, the chapter just completely whiffs on difficulty, which can't really be blamed on the game itself overall, I'd say, as there are genuinely some challenging maps in Sacred Stones. In fact, yeah, one of them is right after this one. Chapter 6 is like genuinely one of the trickier maps in the game. A chapter I actually quite like. I don't think the chapter's lack of difficulty can just be blamed on the game overall. I just think it's a lack of interesting enemy types or like side objectives or like a genuinely formidable force for the blade of face. Boring, I don't like it. Moving on to enjoyability. Like I said, it's at an all-time low. Also, if you're wondering what the difference between enjoyability and replayability is, replayability in my eyes is thinking about the chapter afterwards and going, would I enjoy playing that? While enjoyability is while you're playing it is, am I having a good time while playing this? So now, I just want to establish that. They do kind of overlap, but it makes a nice acronym, so blah, 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 blah. And yeah, no. As I've established multiple times at this point, there is nothing going on in Unbroken Heart. I can think of, like, off the top of my head, what is an enjoyable chapter in Fire Emblem? How about, I don't know, Chapter 22 in Engage. I replayed Engage recently. Chapter 22 in Engage is a rather enjoyable chapter for me. I think it's quite interesting because it takes away a lot of your items and makes you adapt in accordance to that. You have no like rings in that chapter, you have no engage abilities. That's interesting. You have to adapt to that. That is an interesting idea for a chapter. I rather enjoy that chapter. It would succeed on E. This chapter does not. There are no side objectives, there's no wacky gimmicks, there are no alternate routes, there's no reason to split up your units, there's no interesting variety of enemies or weapon types that actually matter, there's no interesting, like, extra mechanics, nothing! This is, like, as bland as it gets. It is simply moving Ephraim and the rest of his goon squad from point A to point B, at which point you will seize and you will wonder why this chapter is even here in the first place. It may as well just be a fucking cutscene. As I've established, I would much rather just play a chapter that is, like, loudly awful, like Arcadia, than one that is, like, quietly awful, like this. It's just kind of... Arcadia is a big bang. This is just a quiet whimper. It's just very, very weak. And that just about wraps it up. Unbroken Heart is one of the weakest chapters in Sacred Stones. Maybe not the worst one overall, but when you're failing on 4 out of the 5 letters and only just scraping by on the one you're succeeding at, it's really difficult to call it anything other than a flavorless mess. Again, there's probably worse chapters overall, but maybe something like the Ghost... No, the Ghost Ship's kind of interesting. Maybe like the Ghost Ship in terms of like kind of unfair difficulty, or the Gorgon chapter for simply being uninteresting, or Darkling Woods for just being an enemy-filled mess. But in terms of like being just plain and simple, not interesting or like meaningful to play, I think Unbroken Heart just really fits the bill in that regard. It still succeeds on flavor though, so, you know, 1 out of 5 ain't bad. But at the end of the day, I would definitely categorize Unbroken Heart as a bad chapter. And that's going to do it for this episode. Hope you guys enjoyed. Join me next week when we'll be talking about a good map instead. We're going to be talking about a different map every single week, obviously. If you want me to talk about a specific map, or like, hey, I want you to talk about FE7 Endgame, or hey, talk about Three Houses, Chapter 1, the mock battle, leave it in the comments. I'm fully open to talking about every single map in the series. Ideally, we would literally talk about every single map in the series. The next 2 episodes are already locked in, I'll say that for free. But after that, it's anyone's game. And to just give you guys a little hint for what the next episode will be about, I'll give you an anagram. You guys like anagrams, right? Fucking, who am I kidding? You play Fire Emblem, of course you like anagrams. So try and deduce, if you care, what the next episode will be with this handy-dandy little piece of gibberish. The next episode will be about Audi Wingding. For those in the back, Audi Wingding. Alright, I'll catch you next time, guys. See you next week. This is gonna be a lot of fun!